Welcome to Nocturne Historia. Before the grandeur of palaces and the might of empires, there were hands in the soil, crafting, planting, building. The birth of Mesopotamian civilization did not begin with kings or conquests, but with the humble rhythms of daily life. At its core was agriculture. In the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, early settlers planted barley, wheat, and flax, adapting their cultivation to the seasonal whims of the rivers. They built small gardens with onions, garlic, and beans, and nurtured date palms, trees that provided not only food but wood, shelter, and even symbolic value. These crops were not just sustenance. They were signs of a society learning to tame nature, diversify its food supply, and hedge against drought and flood. What happens when a community no longer fights for food but begins to shape its environment? It builds. At first, dwellings were circular huts made of reeds and straw, clustered near water. Over time, these evolved into rectangular, mud brick homes, often with central courtyards, a quiet revolution in domestic life. These were not merely structural choices, but reflections of a changing mindset: permanence, privacy, and shared space. Architecture mirrored society, and society was becoming layered. In excavated graves, some bodies rest beside nothing but soil, while others are accompanied by finely painted pottery, carved stones, and even jewels. These burial differences whisper of an early social hierarchy, of craftsmen, farmers, leaders. Alongside them, fragments of irrigation canals suggest coordinated labor. No individual alone could shape such systems. It required community, planning, leadership. Water, it seems, not only grew crops but built the first institutions. As hands tilled and built, minds turned upward. Religion emerged, not as doctrine but as reverence. At Tel Abada, archaeologists unearthed a three-room temple, each chamber a threshold deeper into the sacred. Within its clay walls stood statues of goddesses, their large eyes fixed on the eternal. These deities weren't distant figures of wrath, but embodiments of fertility, of rebirth, of the cycles of the earth. Faith here was not to rule, but to resonate with the soil, the stars, and the womb. Pottery tells its own tale. What began as simple vessels for storage soon became canvases of expression. The clay turned thinner, the shapes more symmetrical, the designs more intricate. This evolution is not trivial. It signifies specialization, surplus, time to create. In other words, civilization. When people no longer need everyone to farm, some become artisans. And artisans leave behind fingerprints of culture. Can a bowl carry philosophy? In Mesopotamia, perhaps it could. Together, these fragments, homes, seeds, graves, statues, pots, compose the earliest verses of a civilization that would echo through millennia. They remind us that greatness does not rise from ambition alone, but from cooperation, adaptation, and belief. From these ancient beginnings, the Mesopotamians did more than survive. They invented a way to live together. In their mud bricks were the blueprints of cities, in their gardens, the roots of economy, in their temples, the stirrings of metaphysics. So the next time we marvel at ziggurats or cuneiform tablets, let us remember the quiet hands that planted onions, shaped clay, and honored the divine in everyday life. Civilization was not imposed from above. It was built layer by layer from below. In the ancient landscapes of southern Mesopotamia, where the arid winds of the desert collided with the life-giving rivers of Tigris and Euphrates, something profound began to emerge. Religion and settlement were no longer fleeting acts of survival, but permanent choices that shaped the destiny of human civilization. At the heart of this transformation stood Eridu, a city considered by many to be the cradle of Sumerian spiritual life. For over 2,000 years, its temple to Enki, the revered god of water and wisdom, was rebuilt and expanded across 17 layers of construction, each layer a silent testament to generations of faith, ingenuity, and perseverance. These were not mere shrines, they were architectural memories, physical embodiments of a worldview that placed divine order at the center of life. But spirituality alone could not sustain a people. Parallel to their sacred commitments, the early Sumerians engineered something equally revolutionary: irrigation. Facing unpredictable floods and scorching droughts, They carved channels by hand to draw water from the rivers to their crops. With mud, reeds, and vision, they built dikes, floodgates, and sediment traps, early infrastructure that required communal planning and execution. It wasn't simply about water, it was about learning to think collectively, to act as a unit bound by necessity and foresight. As the water began to flow in predictable cycles, so did life. The concept of permanent settlement, once a novelty, became a foundation. Families stopped migrating and started anchoring their lives to plots of land. The soil became more than a place to grow food. It became identity, inheritance, and memory. The act of planting seeds was no longer about sustenance alone. It was a ritual, a covenant with time. Across these emerging villages, the economy began to mirror the complexities of this new life. Clay tokens, shaped by hand and impressed with symbols, became early tools of agricultural accounting. These were the ancestors of currency, used to measure grain harvests, track livestock, and manage trade. Each token was a physical manifestation of trust and record-keeping, a way to bring structure to abundance and scarcity alike. Socially, a new fabric was forming. Communities began burying their dead in shared cemeteries, often beneath or beside their homes. This practice reflected a profound shift. Life and death were now tethered to a single geography. These were not just burial sites, they were anchors of belonging. Ancestors lay beneath the same soil that their descendants would till, prey upon, and eventually return to. In this way, land became sacred not only because of the gods worshipped upon it, but also because of the human stories layered within it. All these developments, the rise of temples, the mastery of water, the permanence of homes, the dawn of economy, and the sanctity of burial grounds, were not isolated. They were interwoven, each strengthening the other, creating a complex and resilient tapestry of early civilization. The Sumerians, perhaps unknowingly, laid down the earliest blueprints of what it means to live not just as individuals, but as a society. They taught us that to settle is to believe, to cultivate is to cooperate, and to remember is to belong. In the dust of Eridu and the ripples of its canals, the roots of human society dug deep into the earth and began to grow. By around 3200 BCE, a monumental transformation began to take place in the ancient land of Mesopotamia. Humanity, for the first time, shifted from small agricultural villages to complex urban societies. This shift was not merely about population growth or denser housing. It marked the birth of the city, the crucible of civilization itself. One such city, often believed to be Uruk, reached an astonishing population of 50,000 people, a staggering number for that era. It was enclosed by a massive wall stretching 6 kilometers in length, a clear indication that this was no ordinary settlement. This wall was not just a defense mechanism, but a symbol of collective identity, a physical boundary that defined an emerging civic order. Within these walls stood monumental structures that redefined the relationship between humanity and the divine. At the heart of the city lay the grand temple of Inanna, known as the Inanna Precinct. Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and fertility, was worshipped with deep devotion. The temple complex was surrounded by subsidiary shrines and ceremonial avenues, establishing a sacred geography where processions, rituals, and offerings intertwined the spiritual and political life of the people. This was a space where power, both divine and human, was negotiated daily. Rising alongside it was the ziggurat of Anu, dedicated to the sky god. This towering terraced structure, with its massive stairways reaching toward the heavens, symbolized humanity's yearning for transcendence and order. It wasn't just a building, it was a cosmological statement in mud brick. Living arrangements in these early cities reflected new social dynamics. Houses varied widely in size and quality. Wealthier families lived in multi-room homes with central courtyards, designed not only for comfort but also for privacy and prestige. Poorer citizens resided in modest structures, often cramped and unadorned. Interestingly, many homes had burial vaults directly beneath them, where family members were interred. This practice created a continuity between the living and the dead, rooting families not just in place but in memory. Such urban complexity demanded new forms of organization. In villages, everyone knew everyone else, but in cities, strangers lived side by side. The familiar bonds of kinship gave way to something unprecedented: rules, institutions, and systems to govern a population too large for personal relationships to suffice. Markets had to be regulated, disputes settled, water and waste managed, property defined, and so emerged the earliest bureaucracies: scribes who recorded transactions, officials who managed resources, priests who mediated between gods and men. This marked the dawn of structured governance. But the city was more than a machine for survival. It was a cultural engine. Artisans specialized in crafts. Potters, metalworkers, and weavers honed their trades to new levels of sophistication. Symbols began to appear, inscriptions on clay tablets that evolved into the earliest writing systems. These cities became centers of innovation, where new ideas took root and spread outward like ripples in water. Yet beneath this progress lay tension. The city introduced hierarchy: who had the biggest house, the closest access to the temple, and on the most livestock. Inequality became spatialized, visible in stone and street. But even in its flaws, the city was transformative. It allowed humanity to organize itself on a scale previously unimaginable. It made room not just for living, but for meaning, for ambition, for transcendence. To walk through the streets of ancient Uruk was to witness a new kind of world, one where strangers became neighbors, belief shaped buildings, and humanity first learned how to live together in complexity. As urban life took root in ancient Mesopotamia, the demands of an increasingly complex society gave rise to some of the most transformative inventions in human history. Cities were not just clusters of dwellings, they were engines of necessity, pushing the boundaries of what humans could imagine and create. Among the most groundbreaking developments was writing. In its earliest form, it emerged not from poetry or myth, but from the grain stores and livestock pens of bureaucratic life. Clay tablets were pressed with simple pictographs to record quantities of barley, cattle, and oil. Over time, these marks became more abstract, evolving into cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script that would eventually serve not only merchants and administrators, but priests, kings, and poets. With writing came memory beyond generations, contracts that outlived their makers, and histories carved in clay. Equally transformative was the invention of the wheel. Its earliest use was found in pottery. The slow, steady rotation of the potter's wheel allowed for uniform, elegant vessels. But soon the idea of rotation found new life. Solid wooden discs became early transport wheels, eventually refined into spoke designs that were lighter, faster, and more efficient. Harnessed to oxen, the wheel unlocked mobility and trade on a scale previously unimaginable. It turned carts into caravans and local markets into networks of exchange. While scripts and wheels moved information and goods, metallurgy transformed the very tools people used. At first, artisans hammered native copper into simple ornaments or weapons. But as knowledge deepened, they began to smelt copper in clay kilns, combining it with tin to create bronze, a metal stronger and more durable than either element alone. Ceramic molds allowed for mass production, enabling the rise of specialized tools for farming, building, and combat. The Bronze Age was not merely a period, it was a leap in human potential. These innovations did more than solve practical problems. They reshaped society itself. Writing created scribes and archivists. Wheels demanded carpenters, tanners, and traders. Metallurgy birthed smiths and weapon makers. For the first time, people were no longer bound by the rhythms of the seasons alone. Labor was no longer only agricultural, it was artistic, scientific, and industrial. A sharp departure from village life began to take shape. In place of generalists came specialists, each contributing to a growing interdependence. The social fabric thickened. Authority shifted toward those who controlled tools, knowledge, and production. Urbanization wasn't just about size, it was about complexity. These developments, born of innovation and refined by necessity, laid the structural foundation for civilizations to come. They made the intangible, numbers, ideas, strategy, visible and recordable. They moved weight and distance with speed and purpose. They forged stronger tools, sharper weapons, and finer jewelry. But perhaps most importantly, they showed humanity what it was capable of when driven by vision, challenge, and the need to adapt. From tablets etched in clay to carts rumbling across plains, from kilns roaring with flame to the quiet stroke of a stylus, every invention spoke of a species reaching beyond survival toward meaning, mastery, and memory. Temples in early Mesopotamian cities were not simply places of worship. They were the beating heart of urban life. Chief among them was the Temple of Inanna, or Iana, which served a dual role, spiritual sanctuary and administrative headquarters. Within its walls, rituals and grain storage coexisted, prayers mingled with policies. The temple managed food supplies, controlled redistribution of goods, and functioned as a central economic institution. Farmers brought their harvests as offerings or taxes, and in return, laborers and priests received measured rations. It was a closed-loop economy anchored in the sacred, where faith was inseparable from function. The sophistication of this system gave rise to one of humanity's most powerful tools, accounting. Clay tokens, once used to represent commodities, evolved into tablets inscribed with pictographic symbols. These early forms of record-keeping captured not just inventory but relationships. Who owed what? How much was stored? Who received which portion? Rations were calculated according to age, gender, and occupation. A laborer digging irrigation canals might receive more barley than a craftsman, while a child's portion differed from an elder's. This granularity required abstraction and precision. Mathematics was born not from theory, but from necessity. Entire rooms within the temple were devoted to these tasks, filled with scribes hunched over clay, stamping order into chaos. Soon, the records expanded beyond food. Tablets documented debts and loans with clearly defined interest rates. Some even forecasted crop yields based on seasonal patterns, laying the groundwork for economic planning. What began as divine stewardship became practical governance, and at the heart of it all stood the scribes. Trained from youth, these individuals mastered the emerging script and the logic of systems. They became indispensable. Keepers of knowledge, arbiters of dispute, architects of order. Their education set them apart, elevating them into a distinct social class. These were not priests, nor were they warriors. They were thinkers, administrators, recorders of civilization. Their influence rivaled that of kings because they controlled the flow of information. The temple, once a house of bun, became a bureaucracy housed in mud brick. But this order came with a cost, hierarchy. The city began to reflect stark inequalities. Large homes with multiple rooms and private courtyards stood beside modest one-room dwellings. Tombs adorned with artifacts sat not far from simple graves. Property, labor, and legacy were no longer equally shared. A new class of dependents emerged, laborers bound by debt, war captives, and others whose status was legally subordinate. Though not all were slaves in the modern sense, their lack of autonomy marked the rise of institutional inequality. These distinctions weren't hidden. They were carved into the city's architecture, inscribed in contracts, and passed down in ledgers. Even burial practices reflected this divide. Some were interred beneath their homes with ceremony, others left outside city walls. The city became not just a place of gathering, but of sorting. Sorting by wealth, by skill, by privilege. Yet this system, however uneven, made complexity possible. It allowed thousands of individuals to coexist with shared expectations and stable routines. Rules were no longer oral, they were written. Rights were not assumed, they were recorded. And with every mark in clay, society stepped further from kinship and closer to the state. What had started as collective worship evolved into early bureaucracy. The temple remained sacred, but now it also symbolized power, policy, and permanence. It became the first institution where heaven met earth and where order, once whispered in prayer, was etched in clay forever. In the unfolding drama of early Mesopotamian civilization, power began to shift from the quiet sanctuaries of the temple to the hardened hands of warriors. The rise of kingship, of rulers not merely as priests or stewards of the ones, but as commanding warlords, marked a pivotal transformation in how human beings organized themselves. Once, temples governed the rhythms of society, with priests mediating between the divine and the earthly. But as city-states grew and their interests clashed, it was no longer enough to pray for protection. Power had to be taken, wielded, and defended. The figure of the Lugal, literally big man, emerged, military leaders who consolidated both sacred and secular authority. These early kings claimed divine endorsement. Coronation rituals, temple constructions, and public declarations of divine favor were used not just to inspire reverence, but to legitimize rule. To rule was not simply a matter of strength, it was a matter of celestial approval. Kings built temples not only as acts of devotion, but as monuments to their reign. Religion became political theater, and gods were summoned to endorse mortal ambitions. Yet this consolidation of power was never absolute. Alongside kings, councils of elders, and noble families retained influence, and local temples often operated with semi-autonomy. Mesopotamia was not a monolith of control, it was a fluid network of rival interests, shifting alliances, and contested legitimacy. Power had to be negotiated, reaffirmed, and, at times, wrestled back by force. Nowhere was this clearer than in the chronic warfare between neighboring city-states. Umma and Lagash, for example, clashed repeatedly over disputed territory. These conflicts were not just military. They were legal, religious, and symbolic. Kings inscribed victories on steles, offered spoils to the gods, and redefined borders with each campaign. War became an extension of politics by other means, and conquest a way to sanctify rule. One of the most iconic artifacts from this period, the Standard of captures this duality. On one side, it depicts soldiers in formation, prisoners being marched, and the king towering over the scene, organized violence with divine backing. On the other, scenes of peace, feasting nobles, musicians playing, and the king presiding over order and prosperity. It is not merely an object, it is a manifesto. War and peace, sword and lyre, were two halves of the same crown. Through such artifacts, we glimpse how early kings framed their authority, not merely through force, but through narrative. They were both shepherds and generals, builders of temples and raisers of cities. They walked a narrow path between chaos and order, each decision echoing through both heaven and earth. The evolution from priestly stewardship to royal dominance did not erase religion. It weaponized it. In the figure of the king, the sacred and the strategic became one. And so, in the dusty courts of Lagash, or beneath the high walls of Uruk, the blueprint of statecraft was being drafted, one where gods blessed borders and crowns were forged in both prayer and battle. In the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, war was not merely a disruption of peace, it was a fundamental structure of political life. Kings did not simply wage war to defend borders or expand territory, they fought to define power itself. One of the clearest examples of this is the Stelae of the Vultures, an imposing stone monument erected by King Enatum of the city-state of Lagash. This stela immortalizes a brutal victory in battle, carved in vivid detail. Phalanxes of soldiers march forward, spears thrust into enemies, and vultures descend to feast on the slain. More than just a record, it was a symbol, a declaration of divine favor and royal legitimacy. One side of the monument shows Enatum leading his troops with military discipline. The other depicts the god Ningirsu intervening from the heavens, smiting enemies on the king's behalf. Here, politics, war, and religion converged in a single narrative. The king was not just a ruler, but a chosen agent of the gods. Warfare evolved alongside these stories. Bronze weapons, sharp-tipped spears, composite bows, and reinforced armor revolutionized combat. No longer did farmers drop their tools and grab clubs to fight. Instead, a new social class emerged, professional soldiers. These warriors were rewarded not with coin, but with land and rations. Ashans. They became the king's loyal enforcers, forming a standing army whose allegiance was bound not by kinship, but by command and compensation. Their presence institutionalized warfare as a permanent arm of governance. Battles were not random eruptions of violence. They were strategic, planned, and recorded. The reasons for war often came down to two things: land and water. In a region where agriculture depended on carefully managed irrigation, control over canals was control over life. Conflicts erupted when one city diverted a waterway or expanded too close to another's fields. These were not abstract territorial disputes. They were about survival. And the victors did not merely win prestige, they won productivity. Conquered territories paid tribute, sometimes in grain, sometimes in livestock, sometimes in labor. Prisoners of war became forced workers, building walls, digging canals, or serving in temples. The spoils of war didn't only enrich the palace, they sustained it. War became an economic engine, but it was also a cultural one. Art and architecture often reflected military pride. Palaces displayed battle scenes. Statues depicted kings with weapons in hand. These weren't just decorations, they were visual affirmations of the ruler's strength. The people living under these kings did not dwell in castles or marble villas. They lived in mud brick houses clustered around open courtyards with communal kitchens and central hearths. But even in these everyday spaces, social differences were visible. Some homes were larger, better built, with multiple rooms and family tombs beneath. Others were humble, single-room shelters. Society was layered, and the echoes of war rippled through domestic life. In the rations one received, in the labor one performed, in the security or uncertainty of one's home. War, then, was not a distant thunder. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. It was remembered in stone, rewarded in land, sanctified by geese, and lived in the spaces between walls. The Mesopotamian king was not just a sovereign. He was a commander, a provider, and above all, a storyteller. His legacy was not only in the victories he claimed, but in the symbols he left behind, symbols meant to endure longer than any battlefield ever could. Beyond the drums of war and the declarations of kings, the real heartbeat of Mesopotamia pulsed through the everyday lives of its people. In dusty courtyards, in bustling workshops, beside canals and within temple kitchens, ordinary men and women shaped a civilization not only with bronze and brick, but with bread, games, and learning. At the center of daily life was food, simple yet rich with meaning. Barley, the region's staple crop, was not only baked into loaves but fermented into beer, a beverage safer than water and a cornerstone of communal meals. Vegetables such as onions, garlic, and lentils grew in home gardens, while dairy from goats and occasional cuts of meat rounded out the diet. Meals were shared under open skies or within reed-roofed homes, offering moments of connection amid labor. Leisure found its place even in a world of toil. One of the most iconic remnants of ancient play is the royal game of a strategic board game enjoyed by both elites and commoners. With dice, counters, and rules that blended chance with planning, it was more than entertainment. It was a reflection of order, foresight, and perhaps even fate. In this world, women held positions both powerful and practical. While political and military leadership remained largely male, women were far from silent figures. They could own land, manage their own wealth, and run weaving workshops, a vital industry that supplied both households and temples. Some women served as priestesses, others worked as scribes or healers. In elite circles, noble women held sway over households and estates, their influence often preserved in contracts, seals, and correspondence. Legal records from the era speak of women's rights with surprising clarity. They could inherit property, file for divorce, and were protected under law and marriage agreements. These contracts, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, outlined dowries, child custody, and financial arrangements, underscoring the complexity and structure of family life. Marriage was not merely a social bond, it was a legal institution, negotiated and recorded in the archives of temples and cities. Education, though limited, was not exclusive to men. Some women were trained as scribes, a profession requiring literacy in cuneiform, a rigorous and prestigious skill. Within the walls of scribal schools, mathematical knowledge blossomed. The Mesopotamians developed a base 60 number system, a brilliant abstraction that allowed them to calculate area, volume, and time. This system gave rise to the 60-second minute and the 60-minute hour still in use today. Far from being a mere curiosity, this mathematical foundation enabled the construction of buildings, the planning of irrigation, and the recording of celestial events. Civilization, after all, requires not only culture and courage, but also calculation. Through all of this, a portrait of Mesopotamian daily life emerges, one filled with rhythm, ritual, and resilience. Beneath the shadow of ziggurats and within the echo of royal proclamations, farmers sowed fields, mothers taught daughters, merchants haggled in markets, and children raced beneath the sun. Society was not static, it was dynamic, layered, and full of human texture. The greatness of Mesopotamia was not forged solely on battlefields or in palaces, but in kitchens, classrooms, and courtyards. It lived in the wisdom passed from mother to daughter, in the hum of looms, in the counting of days, in the sharing of bread. And in a world often defined by its rulers, it is in the details of daily life that we find the deepest truths about a people and their place in history. In the world of the ancient Sumerians, knowledge was not merely a means to survive, it was a sacred act, a pathway to uphold the divine order of the cosmos. At the center of this intellectual culture stood the Aduba, the Sumerian school. These were not schools as we know them today. They were rigorous institutions reserved for the sons of elites, particularly those destined to become scribes. Inside these austere clay-walled classrooms, young boys spent long days copying cuneiform characters onto tablets. They learned writing not as art, but as discipline. Alongside literacy, they were drilled in law, mathematics, and literary traditions. Mistakes were punished harshly, and only the most resilient advanced. But this hardship forged a powerful elite, the scribes who would record contracts, dictate policy, preserve prayers, and eventually write myths. Education in Sumer was not about self-expression. It was about order. That same sense of order pervaded their worldview. The Sumerians believed that the universe operated under a set of sacred principles called me, cosmic laws set forth by the gods that governed every aspect of existence. From kingship to temple rituals, from farming to lovemaking, everything had its proper place, its ordained function. Life was not random, it was patterned, and human flourishing depended on aligning with that divine design. The gods themselves embodied this structure. Anu, the sky god, stood above all, a celestial sovereign. Enlil, god of wind and command, was the divine force of authority and decree. Enki, the god of water and wisdom, was the trickster who brought understanding and craft to humans. And Inanna, goddess of love and war, ruled over the most chaotic forces with both seduction and fury. These deities were not distant. They were ever present, shaping the fate of cities, crops, and individuals. The stories the Sumerians told about these gods were not idle entertainment. They were sacred blueprints for understanding the human role in the cosmos. In one foundational myth, humanity is created from the blood of a slain god. The Gum, weary of laboring to maintain the world, chose to fashion a new being, humans, who would take over the burdensome tasks of agriculture, construction, and temple upkeep. This was not a punishment, it was a responsibility. In the myth of Atrahasis, one of the oldest flood stories ever recorded, the gods complain of toil and noise. They decide to send a flood to silence humanity, but the wise Atrahasis builds a boat and survives, echoing later stories like Noah's Ark. Yet beneath these legends lies a central theme. Humans exist to serve, but also to adapt, to endure, and to reason. The Sumerians did not glorify humans as rulers of nature, but as caretakers within it. Their myths place people not at the center of creation, but as part of a delicate hierarchy of obligations between Kazdal, landmen, and each other. This view shaped their institutions, their rituals, their ethics. The act of writing, for instance, was divine imitation, to inscribe meaning onto chaos, just as the gods had done when they shaped the world. Even the architecture of temples mirrored this structure, layered terraces leading upward, reflecting the ascent from earth to heaven. For the Sumerians, literacy was not just power, it was piety. And mythology was not fantasy, it was philosophy. The stories they told defined their place in the universe and justified the systems they built to sustain it. In a society built from mud and fire, surrounded by uncertainty, it was through myths and knowledge that they found permanence. Long before Plato wrote of ideal forms, or Confucius codified social virtue, the Sumerians had already envisioned a cosmos of meaning and educated their sons to preserve it in clay. In ancient Mesopotamia, religion was not confined to temples or holy days. It permeated every corner of life, from the lofty affairs of kings to the quiet rituals of households. To be Mesopotamian was to live within an invisible framework of divine presence, where gods watched, guided, and judged all things. At the heart of this spiritual world stood the temple, not only as a place of worship, but as the beating heart of the city. Each temple was a sacred residence, meticulously cared for by priests who bathed the divine statue, offered meals, clothed it in fine garments, and closed its doors each night. These daily rituals were not symbolic. They were considered real acts of service to living gods who required attention, respect, and sustenance. The temple economy was vast. It employed farmers, weavers, brewers, and scribes, functioning as a religious, economic, and administrative hub. The physical structure of temples reflected cosmic order. Multi-level platforms, outer courtyards, and inner sanctuaries echoed a divine hierarchy. These forms later evolved into the iconic ziggurats, stepped towers that reached toward the heavens, embodying the connection between earth and sky. Religious architecture was not just aesthetic, it was cosmic cartography, mapping the relationship between mortals and the divine. Rituals governed every phase of life. From sunrise to sunset, ceremonies marked transitions, honored deities, and secured favor. Washing the god statue, burning incense, or presenting food were acts not just of tradition, but of necessity. Without these rites, divine presence might withdraw, and with it, protection, order, and fertility. Religion was insurance, negotiation, and reverence, all wrapped in smoke and chant. But this was not a religion reserved only for the elite. Personal devotion flourished within homes. Many families maintained small altars or household shrines, complete with figurines of protective deities. These statues were not idols in the modern sense. They were companions, guardians, and intermediaries. Daily offerings, whispered prayers, and minor rituals created a spiritual intimacy that connected the personal with the cosmic. Every home became a micro-temple, echoing the grandeur of the ziggurat in miniature form. Divination held a unique place in this spiritual ecosystem. The future was not left to chance, but sought through signs. Priests examined the liver of sacrificed sheep, interpreting its curves and markings as messages from the gods. Dreams were analyzed, incense smoke observed, and omens cataloged in detailed manuals. These were not superstitions, they were systems. Each sign had a precedent, each pattern a meaning. The divine will was not hidden. It was coded, and humans had developed techniques to read it. Through these practices, people made decisions, planned marriages, waged wars, and signed treaties. Religion provided not only hope but data. In a world full of uncertainty, the gods offered a method for navigating fate. More than belief, religion in Mesopotamia was structure. It organized society, legitimized kingship, scheduled festivals, and explained the mysteries of weather, disease, and death. It was both lens and anchor, helping people understand their place in the cosmos while grounding them in rituals of daily life. To the modern eye, this may seem foreign, even alien, but in many ways it mirrors our search for meaning, our longing for guidance, our attempts to turn chaos into order. The Mesopotamians, with their temples and tablets, chants and statues, were not so different from us. They too sought protection for their families, signs of hope and hardship, and a sense that someone or something was listening. In the end, their religion was not just a set of beliefs. It was a lived experience, woven into the walls of their cities, the clay of their homes, and the rhythm of their breath. And through this sacred thread, their civilization endured, not just in ruins and relics, but in the timeless human impulse to find the divine in the everyday. In the heart of Mesopotamian civilization, literature was not a luxury. It was a vessel of memory, a sacred mirror of belief, and a tool to preserve what time would otherwise erase. Among its many treasures, one work towers above all, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Composed over centuries, inscribed on clay tablets, this masterpiece is not merely the oldest epic in human history, it is one of the deepest. It tells the story of Gilgamesh, the mighty king of Uruk, a figure both mortal and divine. At the height of his power, Gilgamesh is unmatched in strength, yet lacking in compassion. To humble him, the gods create Enkidu, a wild man from the steppe. The two fight, become friends, and embark on heroic adventures, slaying monsters, challenging Oz, defying fate. But it is Enkidu's death that breaks Gilgamesh. His grief spirals into obsession, and he begins a desperate quest for immortality, seeking the secrets of eternal life across deserts, mountains, and seas. Along the way, he meets Utnapishtim, a survivor of the Great Flood, who tells him a painful truth. Death is the destiny of all mortals. Nothing endures forever, not even kings. The lesson is profound. Gilgamesh returns not with eternal life, but with wisdom. He learns that the true meaning of life lies not in escaping death, but in embracing what it means to be human, in building, remembering, and loving. The epic ends not with conquest, but with contemplation. Through its poetry, the Sumerians expressed a truth many civilizations would echo, that mortality gives life urgency and beauty. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not just a story, it is a meditation on loss, friendship, and the limits of human striving. Its lines still echo because its questions remain ours. But literature in Mesopotamia went far beyond epic adventure. It was deeply intertwined with religious practice. Temples were not only sites of ritual, they were centers of literary production. Hymns, lamentations, and sacred songs filled the libraries and altars. These were not passive texts, they were active invocations, meant to awaken the ones, honor their power, and maintain harmony in the cosmos. A hymn to Inanna, goddess of love and war, would exalt her beauty and wrath in intricate verses. A lament for a destroyed city might cry out to Enlil, begging for mercy and restoration. These texts were chanted, performed, repeated across generations. In a world of fragile order, they served as stabilizing forces, words that upheld the sky. Such writings reveal the Mesopotamian belief that the divine could be influenced through sound, through ritual language. They also show us a society that saw its literature not as entertainment, but as a force, a bridge between heaven and earth. Even funerary texts composed for mourning were written with the intent to guide the soul and comfort the living, echoing cosmic truths about life and death. In all of this, writing was a sacred act. To carve a line into clay was to inscribe a prayer, a contract, or a truth that might outlast storms and kings. The scribes who recorded these works were not merely literate, they were stewards of eternity. Their task was not only to preserve the past, but to shape the spiritual grammar of the present. In the literature of Mesopotamia, we glimpse a civilization striving not just to survive, but to understand, to give form to its fears, meaning to its losses, and voice to its awe. The Epic of Gilgamesh stands as its crown jewel, but around it lies a constellation of sacred texts, each one an echo of a people reaching toward the divine with stylus and story. In the fertile floodplains of Mesopotamia, where myth and memory often walk the same path, the stories of gods and kings became inseparable threads in the tapestry of power. Nowhere is this more evident than in the intertwined tales of Inanna, the goddess of love and war, and Sargon of Akkad, the man who carved the world's first empire. Their narratives, one divine and the other human, reveal how mythology and history collaborated to define legitimacy, resilience, and dominion. Inanna's descent into the underworld stands among the most haunting and profound myths of ancient Sumer. Determined to confront her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, Inanna passed through 7 gates, each one stripping her of garments, jewels, and symbols of power. By the time she reached the final chamber, she stood naked, vulnerable, and alone, and was struck dead. For 3 days and nights, no fertility stirred on earth. The world waited in silence. But the gods intervened. Inanna was resurrected, though not without cost. Her husband Dumuzi was taken in her place. This myth was more than a tale. It was a cosmic metaphor for cycles of death and rebirth, for the price of power, and for the paradox of feminine strength. Inanna was both lover and warrior, giver and taker, descent and ascent. Her story offered a divine mirror to the struggles of rulers who, like her, sought to claim power, endure sacrifice, and restore balance. It is no coincidence that generations later, Sargon's legend would echo similar motifs. According to tradition, Sargon was born to a humble priestess and set adrift in a reed basket on the river. Found and raised by a gardener, he eventually served as cupbearer to the king of Kish, only to overthrow him and rise to rule the known world. His tale, bathed in divine favor and miraculous survival, evoked a sense of destiny. Like Inanna, he rose from obscurity, crossed thresholds of vulnerability, and emerged transformed by power. Sargon's rise was not only mythical, it was military. He assembled what may have been the world's first professional standing army, reportedly 5,400 men who ate bread with him each day. This was not a symbolic force, it was an instrument of expansion. With this army, he conquered the great city of Uruk and captured its king, Lugalzagesi, parading him in chains before the god Enlil. Through campaign after campaign, Sargon established the Akkadian Empire, binding together diverse city-states under a single banner and administrative system. Yet for all its pragmatism, Sargon's authority was continually framed in divine language. He was chosen by the gods, his victories preordained, his rule blessed. Just as Inanna traversed worlds, so too did Sargon bridge the human and the divine, using myth not just as legacy but as political technology. This blend of storytelling and statecraft was not unique, it was foundational. In Mesopotamia, legitimacy often rested not only on conquest, but on narrative. Kings invoked the gods not simply out of piety, but to shape memory, justify rule, and unify people. Inanna's descent taught the lessons of loss, sacrifice, and renewal. Sargon's legend embodied destiny, endurance, and dominion. Together, they show how myth and monarchy co-authored the script of civilization. These stories endured not merely because they were grand, but because they were useful. They offered models of behavior, sources of meaning, and tools of persuasion. They turned clay tablets into scripture, military success into sacred order, and political change into cosmic harmony. And so, as temples echoed with hymns to Inanna, and scribes recorded the exploits of Sargon, a new chapter in human history was written, where gods lent their voices to kings, and kings became characters in the stories that shaped eternity. When Sargon of Akkad rose to power around 2334 BCE, he did more than conquer cities. He forged the first true empire in recorded history. What made the Akkadian Empire revolutionary was not just its military reach, but its systematized approach to governance. Stretching from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea to the waters of the Persian Gulf, the empire encompassed vast and varied lands, controlling critical trade routes that pulsed with goods and ideas. From Lebanon's cedar forest to the mines of Anatolia, from lapis lazuli of Afghanistan to the silver of Elam, Akkad did not merely take resources, it organized their flow. And that organization began at the top. Sargon established a centralized administration that would become the prototype for future imperial models. He placed trusted officials in conquered cities, governors loyal not to local clans, but to the capital. These officials, often trained in Akkad itself, were taught to enforce standardized weights, measures, and legal codes. This administrative cohesion made it possible to manage a realm that spoke many languages, practiced diverse religions, and had little in common except submission to a single authority. The Akkadian court became more than a political hub. It was an incubator of elite continuity. Sons of regional elites were brought to the capital for education and indoctrination, ensuring their future loyalty and administrative alignment. In doing so, the empire transformed personal allegiance into institutional stability. But this stability did not rely on bureaucracy alone. It moved with armies and merchants. The Akkadian military was a standing force, professional and mobile, able to suppress rebellion or project power at the edges of the empire. Meanwhile, trade caravans traveled along ancient highways and river systems, bringing goods as far east as the Indus Valley and as far north as Central Asia. These routes carried not only commodities but culture. Akkadian cylinder seals, inscribed with intricate iconography and script, have been found across the ancient Near East. Each seal was both signature and symbol, a testament to Akkad's presence and prestige. Yet for all this expansion, the Akkadian rulers were careful not to erase the past. Although Akkadian became the language of administration, the rulers continued to honor Sumerian traditions. Scribes copied Sumerian hymns, prayers, and legal formulas, preserving them in Akkadian script. Temples still performed Sumerian rites. This dual system, governance in one language, spirituality in another, allowed for both innovation and continuity. The result was a multicultural yet stable imperial fabric, bound by logistics and belief. Sargon's successors, particularly Naram-Sin's son, would push these ideas even further. Naram-Sin declared himself a living god, the king of the four quarters, asserting divine sanction not just over cities but over directions, over the concept of space itself. Under him, the empire reached its cultural zenith, blending artistic innovation with administrative precision. But as with all empires, strain emerged. Climate shifts, resource exhaustion, and internal dissent eventually fragmented Akkadian control. Still, the template endured. Future empires, from Assyria to Persia to Rome, would borrow from Akkad's blueprints, its centralized rule, its cultural pluralism, its military infrastructure, and its economic integration. In Akkad, the world witnessed for the first time what it meant to be ruled not just by force but by system. It was no longer enough to conquer. One had to connect, to manage, to articulate power through law, trade, and memory. Sargon's dream was not just to dominate, it was to endure. And though his empire would fall, his methods would echo across millennia, in stone and tablet, in road and record. At the height of its power, the Akkadian Empire stood as a symbol of unity, innovation, and imperial ambition. Its reach spanned from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, and its cities pulsed with the rhythm of trade, law, and worship. Yet even as the empire expanded, cracks were forming beneath its golden facade. The reign of Naram Sin, Sargon's grandson, marked both the zenith of Akkadian authority and the beginning of its unraveling. Naram Sin was a ruler of bold vision and divine self-assurance. One of the most iconic artifacts of Mesopotamian art, the victory stele of Naram Sin, depicts him ascending a mountain battlefield, trampling his enemies beneath his feet. He wears the horned crown, a symbol traditionally reserved for gods. This visual declaration of divine kingship signaled a dramatic shift. Naram Sin was not merely chosen by the gods, he claimed to be one. His rule, monumental and ambitious, reshaped the narrative of authority. But deifying a mortal was a dangerous precedent. Tension simmered within the empire. To fund military campaigns and palace construction, taxes increased sharply. Labor was extracted through coercion, and local governors began to resent the growing central control. Rebellions flared across the empire's outer provinces, challenging the idea that Akkad's dominance was unshakable. As political cohesion weakened, a far greater force loomed: nature itself. Around 2200 BCE, the region was struck by a severe and prolonged drought, an event now known as the 4.2 kilo year event. Rainfall diminished, rivers receded, and harvests failed. For an empire dependent on irrigation and agricultural surplus, this was a catastrophe. As canals dried and granaries emptied, famine spread. Entire communities abandoned their fields, migrating toward more hospitable lands or collapsing under the strain. The sophisticated infrastructure that had once fed cities and armies now worked against them. Without water, it became useless. The very foundations of Akkadian power, its cities, its military, its economy, began to erode. This environmental collapse was not interpreted in secular terms. In Mesopotamian thought, the breakdown of order always reflected divine displeasure. One of the most striking literary responses from this period is The Curse of Akkad, a lamentation that blames the empire's fall and Naram Sin's impiety. According to the text, he attacked the temple of Enlil in a fit of rage, provoking the gods to unleash chaos upon his people. Crops withered, cities turned to dust, and invaders swept through once mighty fortresses. Whether literal or allegorical, the poem reflects a deeper cultural memory, a sense that the empire's fall was not just a result of poor harvests or poor leadership, but a cosmic reckoning. The fusion of myth, morality, and memory offered a powerful framework for understanding collapse. In the aftermath, the political landscape fractured. Local rulers rose and fell, and the great Akkadian cities faded into decline. Yet the legacy of the empire endured. Its language, Akkadian, continued to be used in diplomacy and literature. Its administrative systems and military structures were adopted by successor states. And its myths, both of glory and downfall, shaped how later cultures thought about kingship, responsibility, and the fragility of human achievement. Naram Sin's horned crown remains a potent image. Was it hubris or vision? Defiance or destiny? Perhaps both. His story, like that of his empire, is a cautionary epic, one that reminds us that even the most powerful structures are vulnerable to forces beyond their control, whether in the form of drought, rebellion, or the silent judgment of the gods. The fall of Akkad was not a single moment. It was a slow unraveling, a symphony of arrogance, environment, and memory. And in its echoes, we hear one of history's oldest warnings. That greatness, no matter how divine it seems, is never immune to time. The fall of the Akkadian Empire was not a single event, but a slow unraveling, a complex collapse shaped by both external pressures and internal strains. Around 2090 BCE, a new power descended from the Zagros Mountains, the Gutians. These nomadic highland tribes, scarcely understood and poorly organized, urged into Mesopotamia and captured the heart of the empire. In Sumerian records, they are described with disdain, called wild dogs or uncultured wolves, seen as agents of chaos rather than conquerors with vision. Yet for a time, they held the reins of what had once been the most powerful state in the world. Their arrival marked more than a change in leadership. It initiated a period of fragmentation. The centralized administration that Sargon and his descendants had so carefully built began to crumble. Regional governors no longer looked to a distant capital. Trade routes fell into disrepair. Markets withered. The bustling commercial arteries that once connected the empire from the Indus to the Levant grew quiet. Without coordination, cities began to shrink. Some were abandoned entirely. The ceramic styles found in archaeological layers from this time reflect this decline. Standardized imperial pottery gives way to simpler, local forms. What had been a world of unified expression dissolved into scattered identities. And yet, not all was lost. Beneath the surface of political disintegration, cultural continuity persisted. Temples remained active, even in diminished form. One striking example is the Temple of Inanna in Nippur, which continued its rituals despite the surrounding decay. Offerings were made, priests kept calendars, and most notably, scribal schools endured. These were the institutions that trained a new generation of literate elites, sons of priests, administrators, and merchants. They copied hymns, legal texts, and myths on clay tablets, keeping alive the intellectual lineage that stretched back to the Sumerian city-states. In a time when walls crumbled and economies faltered, the written word endured. This cultural resilience suggests that even as empires collapse, the threads of civilization can survive, carried not by armies, but by scholars and stewards of memory. The Gutians, for all their military success, never established an effective government. There was no grand vision, no unifying doctrine. Instead, they ruled haphazardly, often ignoring local traditions and failing to maintain vital infrastructure. Their reign is remembered less for what they built than for what they allowed to decay. It is telling that Sumerian scribes, when writing later histories, treated the Gutian period as an interlude of darkness between eras of greatness. But this darkness was not absolute. In its shadows, city-states began to stir once more. Local rulers reclaimed autonomy. Cultural practices evolved in isolation. And slowly, a new political landscape began to take shape, one that would eventually give rise to the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance under Ur-Nama. The fall of Akkad and the rise of the Gutians remind us that collapse is rarely total. Empires may fall, but temples may still ring with chants. Markets may vanish, but scribes may still write. In the ruins of the First Empire, the flame of civilization flickered, but it did not go out. It awaited the next breath to make it burn again. Long before the towering codes of Hammurabi etched justice into stone, another set of laws quietly laid the foundation for legal civilization. Around 2100 BCE, King Ur-Nama of Ur issued what many scholars now recognize as the earliest surviving legal code in human history. His laws, preserved on clay tablets in Sumerian cuneiform, marked a revolutionary step in humanity's understanding of justice, not as arbitrary decree, but as a system grounded in consistency, reasoning, and equity. The Code of Ur-Nama addressed a wide array of civil and criminal matters: murder, rape, false accusations, theft, slavery, marriage, and agricultural disputes. Its format followed a simple yet profound structure. If, then, a logical formula that mirrored cause and consequence, establishing clear expectations for behavior and punishment. If a man commits murder, then he shall pay X. If a woman falsely accuses someone, then she shall pay Y. This style not only clarified legal procedures, but also began to shape a common legal consciousness across the state. What set the Urnama Code apart was its emphasis on monetary compensation over bodily punishment. Unlike later codes that leaned heavily into physical retribution, eye for an eye, limb for a limb, Urnama's approach sought restoration. Fines and restitution were the preferred forms of justice. This shift reflected a more sophisticated view of crime, not just as a moral failing to be punished, but as a social rupture to be repaired. By encouraging compensation, the state reinforced the value of human life and labor, while also stabilizing society through predictable mechanisms of redress. The laws also acknowledged the complexities of Mesopotamian society. They included stipulations for different social classes, free citizens, dependent laborers, and slaves, offering varying penalties based on status, yet recognizing that all individuals operated within a legal framework. This codification of class-based rights and responsibilities laid the groundwork for bureaucratic order in an increasingly stratified world. The impact of the Code of Urnama was profound. For the first time, legal authority was not merely vested in the whim of rulers or priests. It was visible, repeatable, and transmissible. Citizens could appeal to written precedent, judges could refer to established norms. Traders crossing territories under Ur's control could expect a standardized legal climate, one that facilitated contracts, commerce, and cooperation. The law became more than force, it became infrastructure. In political terms, the code also curbed the excesses of power. By defining acceptable punishments and requiring consistency, it restrained both local governors and elites from abusing their positions. It democratized justice, not in the modern sense, but by creating shared reference points between rulers and ruled. In doing so, it subtly shifted the social contract. Rulers were no longer above the law, they were its guarantors. Urnama's code was as much a political tool as a legal one. By presenting himself not just as king, but as lawgiver, he aligned his authority with order, fairness, and divine mandate. He wasn't merely conquering territory, he was civilizing it. And in a region where divine kingship often claimed supernatural favor, grounding legitimacy in law brought a new kind of sacredness, one rooted in reason. Though only fragments of the original tablets remain, the spirit of the Code of Urnama still echoes. It reminds us that even in the early dawn of statehood, humans sought systems to resolve conflict, define justice, and balance authority with accountability. Law in this vision was not simply punishment, it was peace written in clauses, coexistence inscribed in clay. And from these ancient foundations, a vast architecture of legal thought would eventually rise, carrying the legacy of Urnama far beyond the walls of his city into the lexicons of empires and the frameworks of modern civilization. Amid the shadows of imperial collapse, a new light rose from the city of Ur. It came in the form of a king named Shulgi, the second ruler of the third dynasty of Ur, whose reign around 2094 to 2047 BCE marked a golden age of Sumerian revival. Shulgi was more than a sovereign. He was an architect of order. Under his rule, administration became art. He reorganized the empire into provinces, each overseen by royal officials directly accountable to the central court. These governors were not chosen for lineage, but for loyalty and performance. With this structure, Shulgi ensured that power flowed inward, toward the throne, rather than outward into the hands of regional elites. Communication was key. A relay system of messengers was established, connecting distant provinces to the capital. Orders, reports, and inventories moved swiftly along these routes, creating a nervous system for the empire. Taxation, too, was refined. Instead of flat levies, Shulgi's government assessed taxes based on the productivity of the land. Fields were measured, yields were calculated, and expectations were set accordingly. This precision allowed for fairness, at least in theory, and optimized resource collection. At the heart of this system was the Bala, a redistribution network that required provinces to contribute goods and labor in rotation. One year, a region might send barley and workers, the next, livestock or craftsmen. This system sustained the temple economy, fed the capital, and supported massive construction projects. But more than that, it symbolized balance. Every part of the empire owed something, and every part gave. Yet Shogi's ambitions were not only administrative. He fashioned himself a cultural paragon. In inscriptions, he boasted not only of his military victories and building campaigns, but of his intellect and endurance. One famous account describes how he ran 160 kilometers between religious ceremonies in different cities, and all in a single one, to demonstrate his divine fitness. Whether this feat is fact or propaganda, its message is clear. Shogi wanted to be remembered not just as a king, but as a model of human potential. Under his patronage, literature flourished. Hymns were written in his honor. Scribes composed praise poems, wisdom texts, and chronicles. Schools of writing expanded, ensuring that the next generation would inherit not just governance, but culture. Shogi's reign saw a standardization of language, education, and ritual. The Sumerian script became more uniform, literary forms more structured, religion and administration fused in stone and syllable. His legacy was inscribed in both clay tablets and public monuments. Statues of him portrayed not just a warrior, but a scholar, a king whose strength came from the pen as well as the sword. Of course, beneath this gleaming surface were tensions. The bureaucracy he built was vast and demanding. The taxes and labor it extracted, while organized, were still burdensome, and propaganda often masked dissent. But even so, Shogi's system endured. It became a model for future Mesopotamian governance. His centralized administration, provincial rotation of obligations, and cultural integration created a state that could outlast the man himself. Shogi did not conquer new lands in the manner of Sargon or Naram Sin, but he conquered complexity. In doing so, he showed that empires could rise not only through war, but through design. His vision was of an ordered world, a kingdom where gods were praised, fields were counted, poems were copied, and kings ran between altars as symbols of devotion. In that vision, we glimpse the enduring hope of civilization, that power, when paired with wisdom, might create not just monuments, but meaning. In the golden twilight of the Neo-Sumerian Empire, under the reign of King Shogi, Mesopotamia witnessed not just political consolidation, but a cultural and intellectual renaissance. Shogi's long and stable rule allowed a flourishing of education, science, medicine, and the refined art of fermentation, advancements that would leave an enduring imprint on human civilization. At the heart of this transformation was the Aduba, the scribal school. These institutions trained the next generation of bureaucrats, priests, and scholars. Students, mostly boys from elite families, spent years mastering cuneiform writing, mathematics, legal codes, in classic Sumerian literature. The curriculum was rigorous, the discipline harsh. Misbehaving students were punished physically, their errors corrected with reed canes and stern reprimands. Yet the Aduba was not merely a place of memorization. It was the engine of statecraft, producing the literate elite who would preserve knowledge and administer cities. Through these schools, culture was not only transmitted, but transformed into a tool of governance. Medicine, too, advanced with remarkable nuance. Healers and physicians began to separate natural illness from divine punishment. Diagnoses were recorded on clay tablets, detailing symptoms, prognoses, and treatments. Some procedures even describe forms of surgery, the use of scalpels, and wound care. Prescriptions included elaborate mixtures of herbs, minerals, and animal products, revealing a deepening empirical tradition. Yet spiritual explanations remained entwined with practice. Incantations often accompanied treatment, reflecting a worldview where the physical and metaphysical remained intertwined. This dual approach, natural and supernatural, allowed Mesopotamian medicine to navigate both the body and the soul. Meanwhile, the science of brewing reached new heights. Beer, a staple of the Mesopotamian diet, was elevated to both an economic and sacred commodity. Records list over 20 types of beer, varying in strength, clarity, and flavor. Brewing techniques were standardized, with recipes inscribed and processes regulated. Beer was not only consumed in religious rituals, but used as payment for labor, often representing up to one-third of the total barley yield. It nourished workers, sustained communities, and played a central role in feasts and offerings. In every sip was the labor of fields, the precision of craft, and the blessing of the divine. Perhaps most astonishing was the development of astronomy. Mesopotamian scholars observed the stars with precision, tracking lunar phases and solar movements. They constructed a lunisolar calendar, balancing the cycles of moon and sun through intercalary months. Their observations led to the discovery of the Metonic cycle, a 18-year period after which lunar phases align with the solar year, a principle that would later underpin Western astronomy. These achievements were not abstract. They regulated festivals, agricultural planning, and legal timelines. Time itself became a measured, predictable force, mapped across clay tablets and etched into cosmic charts. Shulgi's reign wove these elements together into a coherent vision of civilization. His court patronized scholars, sponsored temple construction, and issued reforms that unified distant provinces. Under his rule, Mesopotamia became a crucible where practical need met intellectual ambition. Knowledge was systematized, ritualized, and deployed to strengthen both the state and the spirit. This period reveals a vital truth, that civilization is not built on conquest alone, but on curiosity, experimentation, and discipline. In the dusty rooms of Idubus, the clean incisions of healers, the bubbling vats of brewers, and the quiet calculations of stargazers, Mesopotamia sought not only to survive, but to understand. Their questions about health, time, language, and justice were universal. Their answers, carved into tablets and passed through generations, would travel far beyond the Euphrates. And so, beneath the careful gaze of Shulgi, an empire reached for knowledge as surely as it once reached for land. Its legacy lives not only in ruins, but in the very rhythms of our calendars, the structure of our schools, and the coded recipes that still ferment our grains into celebration. At the height of Mesopotamian civilization, the pursuit of knowledge was not limited to temples or royal courts. It extended into the rhythms of trade, the demands of justice, and the patterns of the stars. The city of Ur, under the later kings of the Third Dynasty, became a beacon of administrative sophistication and intellectual ambition. Nowhere was this more visible than in its libraries. These were not metaphorical spaces, but literal rooms filled with thousands of clay tablets, carefully cataloged and stored. From legal codes and contracts to medical texts, astronomical predictions, and dictionaries, these collections represented one of humanity's earliest organized systems of knowledge. Some tablets even included primitive tables of contents and classification marks, an embryonic form of indexing that foreshadowed modern library science. This systemization of knowledge was no mere scholarly endeavor. It had real-world applications, particularly in the realm of economics. As cities grew and commerce expanded, the need for standardized information became critical. Units of weight and volume were harmonized across regions. Trade contracts included fixed interest rates and clauses for delayed delivery or damaged goods. Investment agreements outlined profit-sharing schemes. Disputes were resolved in specialized courts, proto-commercial tribunals that issued rulings based on precedent and record. These were not ad hoc negotiations. They were the mechanisms of a market economy taking form in clay. Merchants, even multilingual and well-traveled, relied on scribes not only to draft contracts, but to consult archives, searching for prior rulings or reliable partners. In this way, bureaucracy did not stifle trade, it enabled it. Yet beneath this impressive order lay signs of strain. The very success of irrigation agriculture, which had fueled the rise of Sumerian cities, began to undermine itself. Over centuries, the constant diversion of river water onto fields led to salinization. As salts accumulated in the soil, yields declined. Once productive lands became increasingly barren, forcing shifts in crop patterns and reductions in tax revenue. This ecological degradation had cascading effects: food shortages, economic stress, and rising demands on peasant labor. Meanwhile, external pressures mounted. Amorite tribes from the west and Elamite forces from the east probed the empire's borders. These were not full-scale invasions at first, but persistent incursions, testing the state's ability to project power beyond its core. The response required military mobilization, which in turn strained finances already weakened by declining harvests. Soldiers had to be paid, fortifications maintained, alliances brokered. What had once been a tightly woven administrative net began to fray at the edges. And yet, even in this moment of slow fragmentation, the cultural engine kept turning. Scribes continued to copy texts, expanding the literary and legal heritage of Sumer. Temples maintained rituals with astonishing continuity. Trade networks remained functional, even if more precarious. The legacy of this era was not its collapse, but its coherence under pressure. The libraries of remind us that knowledge was power, not in the abstract, but in the tangible. The ability to manage grain, to resolve disputes, to navigate markets, and to plan for floods and stars. This was a civilization that understood that ideas, when recorded, became tools, tools for order, tools for continuity, even tools for resilience. The scribes who etched these truths into clay did not know if their empires would last, but they knew the value of permanence. And through their careful lines and structured archives, they left a record not only of what they believed, but of how they endured. In their hands, civilization became self-aware. It remembered itself, and for a time it flourished not only in might, but in meaning. In the year 2004 BCE, the city of once the jewel of Sumerian civilization, fell to the armies of Elam. Its temples were looted, its people scattered, and its ziggurats left in ruin. To many, it marked the final chapter of Sumer, the end of a culture that had given the world its first writing, laws, and cities. But history does not end so cleanly. While empires crumble, culture often survives in subtler forms, reshaped, repurposed, and remembered. The fall of was traumatic. Contemporary records speak not only of physical devastation, but of spiritual abandonment. The elegiac poem, Lament for describes the gods departing from their temples, the skies weeping over broken walls, and priests silenced in the dust. It was not merely a city that fell, it was a worldview. The cosmic order, once so carefully upheld through rituals and architecture, had collapsed. But even as political control shifted, the Sumerian legacy endured. The Sumerian language began to fade from daily speech, replaced by Akkadian and Amorite dialects. Yet it remained deeply embedded in sacred rites and scholarly instruction, much like Latin would centuries later in medieval Europe. Sumerian texts were copied, recited, and studied in scribal schools. Hymns, proverbs, and legal codes continued to circulate, preserving the intellectual core of a lost civilization. This continuity was most visible among the Amorites, tribal peoples who migrated into Mesopotamia and gradually assumed power. They did not destroy Sumerian traditions. They integrated them. Adopting the city-state model, temple practices, and written administration, the Amorites laid the groundwork for new dynasties, most notably Babylon. Figures like Hammurabi would later stand atop a foundation shaped by Sumerian thought, even as their own cultural identity evolved. The fusion of Sumerian sophistication with Amorite dynamism produced a rich and resilient cultural synthesis. Institutions such as the Aduba, the scribal schools, remained active, ensuring the transmission of knowledge across generations. Astronomical observations continued to chart the heavens, medical texts detailed diagnoses and treatments, and mathematics retained its precision and complexity. In these disciplines, Sumer lived on, not as nostalgia, but as methodology. The temples, too, survived. Though many were rebuilt under new regimes and names, their basic structures and functions remained. Offerings were made, gods renamed or adopted, but the sacred geography of Mesopotamian religion stayed rooted in its Sumerian origins. The rituals of purification, sacrifice, and festival did not vanish. They adapted. Cultural memory found new hosts. What we see in this transition is not the death of a civilization, but its metamorphosis. Sumer did not vanish in the flames of It dispersed, reconfigured, and settled into the bones of emerging empires. Its influence became foundational rather than dominant, quiet but indelible. The very act of lamenting its fall became a part of its endurance. Like ashes scattered over fertile ground, Sumerian ideas seeded the civilizations that followed. The story of fall is thus not just one of loss, but of persistence. It reminds us that human achievement, be it linguistic, architectural, scientific, or spiritual, rarely disappears entirely. It evolves. It migrates. It survives in the minds and methods of those who come after. And so, as Amorite kings ruled from Babylon, and scribes pressed styluses into new clay tablets, the voice of Sumer still whispered in the rituals, the calendars, the laws, and the stars. The past was never truly gone. It had simply changed its form. By the dawn of the second millennium BCE, the political dominance of the Sumerians had faded. Their cities were conquered, their kings dethroned, and their language slowly gave way to Akkadian. But civilizations do not end with the fall of their rulers. The legacy of Sumer did not vanish. It transformed. Beneath the shifting dynasties and changing tongues, the cultural infrastructure of Sumer remained deeply embedded in the Mesopotamian world. Temples, those architectural expressions of divine order, continued to operate under new regimes. The structures were not razed, they were repurposed. Priests still offered sacrifices. Calendars still marked holy days. The rituals may have adapted, but their framework endured. So too did the schools, the scribal institutions known as Eduba. Long after Sumerian ceased to be spoken in the streets, it remained the language of learning. Young scribes trained in Akkadian courts still copied Sumerian hymns, laws, and myths. To study Sumerian was to study the foundations of civilization itself. Even administrative practices outlived the empire. Tax ledgers, land surveys, and grain inventories continued to follow formats developed centuries earlier in Ur and Uruk. As new powers rose, Babylonia, Assyria, they inherited not only the land but the paperwork. The cuneiform script, once etched to record temple offerings, was adapted to new tongues, Akkadian, Hittite, Elamite. Later, its influence would echo into the alphabets of Phoenician traders, and from there into Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic. Each letter we write today carries a faint shadow of those ancient, wedge-shaped marks. The impact of Sumer reached beyond language. Its model of urban planning, the clustering of homes around courtyards, the division of space into religious, commercial, and industrial zones, became the blueprint for cities throughout the ancient Near East. The very idea of a city, organized system where temples, markets, artisans, and governance coexist in interlocking function, began in Sumer. The architecture of society was one of their lasting innovations, but perhaps more profound was their mastery of foundational technologies. The wheel, developed not for transport at first, but for pottery, would revolutionize trade and labor. The plow, yoked to oxen, transformed agriculture from subsistence to surplus. Irrigation systems, with their canals and levees, made the unpredictable rivers into instruments of stability. These were not minor inventions. They were multipliers of human potential. They enabled population growth, labor specialization, and economic networks that could span hundreds of miles. In short, they made civilization scalable. And with scale came complexity, a challenge the Sumerians met with systems: writing to remember, law to arbitrate, myth to unify. It's tempting to speak of the Sumerians as a vanished people, but their ideas remain beneath the skin of the modern world. Their myths inspired later epics. Their contracts foreshadowed commercial law. Their temples laid the groundwork for sacred architecture. Even their worldview, that humanity is tasked not merely with survival, but with stewardship, echoes in philosophies and religions that came millennia later. Sumer did not die. It was absorbed, adapted, and perpetuated. Like sediment carried by a river, its essence settled into every layer of Mesopotamian culture, and from there into the broader currents of human history. To trace their legacy is not to look backward, but to recognize the deep roots beneath our present structures. In our cities, our scripts, our rituals, and our reasoning, we still walk paths first laid in the alluvial plains of Sumer. Those Sumerian cities vanished beneath millennia of dust. Their ideas continued to echo through time, silently shaping the foundations of modern civilization. In mathematics, law, and mythology, the Sumerians planted seeds that would blossom across continents and centuries. These contributions, long obscured and only rediscovered in the 19th century through archaeological excavation and cuneiform decipherment, reveal a civilization not only ancient, but astonishingly advanced. Their mathematical system remains one of the most sophisticated of the ancient world. Built on a base 60 structure, it allowed for greater divisibility than our current decimal system. This sexagesimal approach gave rise to the 60-minute hour and 360-degree circle, concepts we still use today. But it went deeper. Sumerians developed positional notation, using symbols to represent units, tens, and larger magnitudes depending on placement, an early form of the place value system. They also worked with reciprocals, enabling division and fractional calculations. These were not mere counting tools. They were instruments of engineering, allowing for precise measurement in land surveying, construction, and irrigation planning. The ziggurats they built and the canals they carved were not feats of brute labor alone, but of mathematical reasoning. Just as their numbers organized space, their laws organized society. The Sumerians pioneered the written legal code, as seen in the Code of Ur-Nama. It systematically classified crimes, prescribed punishments, and emphasized fairness through structured restitution. Unlike arbitrary judgments, these laws were written, visible, and crucially, hierarchical, differentiating between intentional and accidental harm, between social classes, and between civil and criminal matters. This model profoundly influenced later legal traditions, including the famed Code of Hammurabi, as well as Mosaic law, Greek democratic systems, and Roman jurisprudence. The idea that laws should be written, proportional, and binding upon both ruler and ruled traces its roots to Sumerian clay. But perhaps the most surprising legacy lies in myth. Sumerian stories, once considered local religious lore, bear uncanny resemblance to later global traditions. The tale of a great flood, for example, appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utanapishtim survives a divine deluge by building a boat, releasing birds, and offering sacrifice, parallels that mirror the story of Noah in the book of Genesis. Another enduring motif is the creation of humans from clay, crafted by gods to perform labor, a theme echoed in Greek, Hebrew, and even Chinese origin myths. These resonances suggest that Sumerian mythology was not just a product of one people, but part of humanity's shared spiritual grammar. For centuries, these contributions lay forgotten. Sumer itself was unknown to the modern world until the 18s, when explorers and archaeologists began unearthing strange tablets in the sands of Iraq. At first mistaken for Assyrian or Babylonian artifacts, the text revealed a language even older, Sumerian. Slowly, through the painstaking work of linguists and historians, a buried civilization came back to life. Temple records, trade agreements, poems, and astronomical tables spoke of a people who had built the scaffolding of the human story. The rediscovery of Sumer reframed our understanding of history. No longer was Egypt the sole cradle of civilization. Sumer, older still, stood as an intellectual giant whose contributions had merely been eclipsed by time. In recognizing this legacy, we are reminded that knowledge is not always linear. It is often cyclical, lost and found again, lost across ages. Today, when we glance at a clock, consult legal codes, or read a story of divine creation, we are unknowingly touching the legacy of the Sumerians. Their ideas pulse beneath our institutions, our measurements, our imaginations. They taught us to count, to legislate, to wonder. And though their voices were silenced for thousands of years, their wisdom now speaks again, not in whispers, but with the enduring clarity of truth rediscovered. For centuries, the Sumerians were forgotten, buried beneath desert sands, remembered only as shadows in later myths. But in the modern age, their story was unearthed, not by kings or poets, but by archaeologists with shovels, scholars with notebooks, and satellites orbiting the Earth. The rediscovery of Sumer is one of the great intellectual adventures of our time. In the 1920s, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley led excavations at the ancient city of Ur. What he found astonished the world: royal tombs lined with gold, elaborate lyres adorned with bullheads, and delicate jewelry that spoke of a refinement no one had expected from such a distant past. These artifacts told a story of wealth, ceremony, and sophistication, one that challenged previous assumptions about early civilizations. The past, it seemed, was far richer than imagined. But artifacts were only part of the puzzle. The real breakthrough came with the decipherment of cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script impressed into clay tablets. Beginning in the 19th century, European scholars painstakingly compared inscriptions, working through linguistic riddles to reconstruct the long-lost Sumerian language. Each translation unlocked new worlds: hymns to gods, medical texts listing treatments and prescriptions, star charts mapping the heavens, and epics recounting ancient struggles. Through these recovered texts, Sumer emerged not as a footnote in history, but as a foundation. The first cities, the first codified laws, the first schools, the first attempts to understand the universe not only through myth, but through measurement. In short, the first experiment in what we now call civilization. Modern science has extended this rediscovery. Satellite imagery has traced ancient canals, revealing how Sumerians engineered landscapes to support dense urban life. Soil samples and plant remains have reconstructed patterns of agriculture and climate. Genetic analyses of human remains have begun to map migrations and family structures. Through carbon dating and stratigraphy, archaeologists have peeled back layers of time, building a chronology more precise than ever before. These findings paint a vivid picture, a people who began as riverine farmers, clustered along the Tigris and Euphrates, slowly building temples, then towns, then walled cities. They developed institutions to manage labor, distribute grain, and record the will of the gods. They charted stars, tracked seasons, and debated justice. They celebrated beauty in sculpture and music, and wrestled with mortality and poetry, but they also struggled with floods, with drought, with war and inequality. Their cities rose and fell, their empires expanded and fractured. And yet, even in decline, they passed on their knowledge, not through conquest, but through continuity. The story of Sumer is not merely about what was invented first. It is about what it means to build a society, to create systems where strangers can coexist, to pass down memory across generations, to inscribe not only power but purpose into the clay of time. In studying them, we study ourselves, not in mirror but in origin. Their questions remain ours. How do we govern fairly? What do we owe to the divine? How should we live, knowing we will die? These are not ancient concerns. They are human ones. And so, the rediscovery of Sumer is more than historical. It is philosophical. It reminds us that our modern institutions, our alphabets and legal codes, our cities and sciences did not appear from nothing. They are part of a lineage, a legacy, a long and fragile inheritance stretching back over 5,000 years. The Sumerians were the first to try what we are still trying, to live together in complexity, to order the world through knowledge and belief, and to make meaning in the face of impermanence. In recovering their story, we do not merely learn history, we reclaim a chapter of ourselves. And yet, this is only the beginning. What happened after Sumer fell? How did their legacy shape Babylon, Assyria, and the civilizations yet to rise? If the story of the first cities teaches us who we were, then the empires that followed reveal who we became. Join us in the next chapter as we follow the thread of memory into the age of kings, prophets, and the forging of ancient empires. The journey continues because history never truly ends. It only waits to be remembered.